Now let's move on to the third and last part of this lecture. So, in the previous part, we discussed about external respiration. Now we will discuss about the internal respiration. Internal respiration basically is the exchange of gases between the body cells and the blood in the systemic capillaries. So if the external respiration occurs in the lungs, the internal respiration occurs not in the lungs but in the tissues of your body. So the oxygen enters the tissues and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the tissue. So what happens here is basically the reverse of the external respiration. In external respiration, the oxygen enters the bloodstream and carbon dioxide exits it. In internal respiration, the oxygen exits the bloodstream towards the tissues, and you have carbon dioxide entering the bloodstream. So the diffusion is because of course, Dalton's law, partly Dalton's law, and of course the movement of passive diffusion, high to low concentration. So we have partial pressure of oxygen in the capillary beds of the systemic circuit is approximately 95 millimeter mercury, whereas your partial pressure of oxygen in most tissues is about 40 millimeter mercury. So you have a lower concentration in the tissues than in the blood. So of course the oxygen will go from the high to low, so from the blood to the tissues. So this gradient allows the oxygen to leave the blood and enter the respiring cells without requiring energy from the body. So this is all passive. So we do not have to expend extra energy for that. This is all spontaneous. So cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide. When we talk about cellular respiration, it's not the exchange of gases, but rather the formation of our ATP, which is the energy unit of living organisms. So cellular respiration is basically a chemical reaction, whereas your glucose is degraded, or rather metabolized, and forms it undergoes glycolysis and then to the Krebs cycle, where it becomes carbon dioxide. So that's the byproduct or the end product of the cellular respiration. Now you have because of this one, it consistently produces carbon dioxide, and so there is always a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the tissues, which is expelled through your respiration. So because of the high concentration of carbon dioxide will enter the bloodstream, and it's actually the carbon dioxide is actually transported in the form of your carbonic acid. So that's causes the partial acidity in the bloodstream. So and it travels to the lungs, where it is expelled as carbon dioxide by the body. So this is your external internal respiration. So external respiration occurs inside the lungs, in particular on the alveoli sacs. So you have high concentration of oxygen in the outside air, because remember, our atmospheric air is 21% oxygen, and a low concentration of carbon dioxide, that's less than 1% carbon dioxide for our atmospheric air. Because of the high oxygen content in the atmospheric air, the oxygen enters the bloodstream. So it is directed towards the tissues, where the oxygen, being a low concentration in the tissues, it diffuses from the bloodstream toward the tissues, and the bloodstream picks up the carbon dioxide, again because of the differences in their partial pressures. So it picks up carbon dioxide and goes back to the lungs, where your blood is basically refueled with oxygen, and it disposes of the carbon dioxide. So basically that's respiration. So what makes the blood pick up oxygen? That is due to the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein inside our blood cells. It is actually quite a large protein. It consists of 4 subunits. So this protein can pick up 4 oxygen molecules. So the hemoglobin is the one that gives the red color to the blood. That's why oxygen-rich blood is seen as a vibrant red color. So the reason for that is because of the iron. The hemoglobin contains iron, in particular 4 iron molecules, 4 iron atoms in what you call the heme group. So this iron has the affinity, or it binds to the oxygen, in the lungs, so it picks up the oxygen. So the hemoglobin molecules in red blood cells carry oxygen as the blood circulates. So pick up oxygen through a bond between the oxygen molecule and the iron atom of the hemoglobin's heme complex. So the hemoglobin affinity to oxygen is such that in conditions where under the conditions, for example, in the alveolar sac of the lungs, so the oxygen binds to the hemoglobin. And in the conditions of lower oxygen, you have a lower affinity of the hemoglobin to the oxygen. So basically, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is not that strong, such that when it's needed to be bound, it is bound. For example, inside the lungs, and when it's time for the oxygen to be distributed to the cells, the binding comes off. So it's not a permanent bond. So the hemoglobin-bound oxygen is the oxyhemoglobin. So we have a hemoglobin which is best known for carrying oxygen, but it also conveys about 23% of the total carbon dioxide through the bloodstream, because it can also bind carbon dioxide, but quite weakly. Now, there's an issue about carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide is basically a form, basically it's carbon and oxygen. So the thing with carbon monoxide is that it has a higher affinity for hemoglobin than oxygen. So in the case of carbon monoxide poisoning, instead of oxygen, because carbon monoxide has higher affinity to hemoglobin than oxygen, instead of binding oxygen, the hemoglobin binds carbon monoxide, and it binds more tightly. So the issue is that it not only competitively inhibits oxygen binding, but it also, because it's very tight binding, it also renders that particular hemoglobin unusable. Because again, hemoglobin, due to the circulation, it's being reused. So in the lungs, it's like a courier. So in the lungs, you pick up oxygen and deliver it to the rest of the tissues, and then it unloads the oxygen and then goes back to the lungs for another round of picking up oxygen and delivering it. Now, if it's carbon monoxide, since it binds tightly, so it really won't get off. So it renders your hemoglobin almost useless. So it gives it the carbon monoxide poisonings basically suffocates you, because the oxygen won't be delivered to the rest of your tissues. So here, by the way, is your saturation of hemoglobin. So the affinity of hemoglobin with the affinity of oxygen to hemoglobin is also affected by the pH of the blood. So it actually makes sense, because inside the lungs there is a low blood pH, because again, carbon dioxide is expelled there, and inside the tissues on the body there is a high pH. It's the other way. When I say high pH is basic. So high blood pH in the lungs, because there is a low carbon dioxide content, because a high acidic carbon dioxide forms the acidic carbonic acid, so it lowers blood pH. So at lower blood pH, so you have basically your saturation of hemoglobin. So in here, as you can see, at high blood pH, whereas there is low carbon dioxide content, the affinity of oxygen to hemoglobin is higher than at low blood pH. So that means in the vicinity of the lungs, where there is a high blood pH, because there's low carbon dioxide there's low carbonic acid content. So the hemoglobin has higher affinity at the same partial pressure, at the same saturation of oxygen, mind you. It is a higher affinity at high blood pH. So it makes sense, because in the lungs, the hemoglobin must be able to pick up oxygen. And then in the tissues, it lowers. So inside the tissues, you have high carbon dioxide content, high carbonic acid. So it's acidic. So if it's acidic, it's lower. The pH is lower. So at lower pH, the affinity of oxygen to hemoglobin is lower also. Now, since it is lower, the oxygen will be able to unbind itself from hemoglobin and be able to be distributed to the tissues. which is actually a very brilliant thing for hemoglobin, because again, when you need to pick up oxygen, you have a higher affinity for that. When you need to release the oxygen, in the case of the tissues, you have a lower affinity for oxygen. So it actually goes with our favor. Now, let's look at the effect of temperature to hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. Again, inside the lungs, there is air. There is a lower temperature there because, of course, outside air is cooler. Well, normally cooler than our internal temperature. So, the lower temperature has higher affinity for oxygen, and the higher temperature inside the tissues and cells of our body, it lowers the affinity of hemoglobin, of oxygen to hemoglobin. So, you have, at low temperature, the hemoglobin will be able to pick up more oxygen, or has an easier tendency to pick up oxygen, whereas at higher temperature, it is easy to release the oxygen, so that makes it easier for the hemoglobin to release oxygen inside our cells. So those are the effect of temperature and pH. Now for carbon dioxide. So 23% of carbon dioxide binds to the protein portion of hemoglobin, forming the carbaminohemoglobin, which is HbCO2. So 7% of the carbon dioxide is carried as dissolved gases, and 70% is moved as bicarbonate ions. So this forms the carbonic acid. That's why it's, again, the difference in the pH in the systemic side, that is the blood inside the tissues and cells, versus the blood in the lungs. So there's a lower pH on the systemic than the blood in the lungs. So the bicarbonate ion in the plasma then serves as the buffer. It maintains the blood pH. So even though you have a difference in the pH between the systemic blood and the pulmonary, the blood in the pulmonary circulation, the difference is actually very minute. There's a very small difference. So because of this, our blood is able to maintain within the safe range of acidity. So this is the formation of carbonic acid from carbon dioxide. So again, this is another view of the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So you have carbon dioxide going out and oxygen coming in. So the oxygen diffuses and is bound by hemoglobin, then delivered to the rest of the body. And then for the carbon dioxide, it's either carbonic acid or the carboxyhemoglobin, and then diffuses out to the alveolar sac. And this is for the internal respiration. This is between the blood and your cells of the body. So the reverse, oxygen is released, carbon dioxide is being picked up. Now, let's look at the respiratory health. Now, people can survive a few days without water, a few weeks without food, but we cannot survive a few minutes without air. So the upper respiratory tract is susceptible to infection and inflammation of the nasal passages, sinuses, and larynx. So one of the most common upper respiratory diseases is the sinusitis, which is the inflammation and swelling of the sinuses caused by the release of histamines. So because the breathing is very important to health, because of course we need a constant supply of oxygen, especially our brain needs a constant supply of oxygen. The proper functioning of the respiratory system is very critical. That is why in today's pandemic situation, it is actually very very important to maintain our respiratory health, because of course when we cannot breathe, we will definitely die. So in this in the upper respiratory tract, we have sinusitis. This is your inflammation or swelling. So sinusitis can cause blockages in the upper respiratory tract. So the acute and the chronic. For the chronic sinusitis is more severe and the causes for chronic sinusitis are less clear. When we say less clear, there is little information. We're still researching on that. So most people who suffer from chronic sinusitis also have allergies, asthma, or a compromised immune system. So otitis media is the inflammation of the middle ear, causing the eardrum to distend into the middle ear and fill with fluid. So sometimes it can also affect your respiratory tract. So in the case of the lower respiratory tract, there are the diseases are either obstructive, whereas it's obstructing there is a blockage in the normal flow of gases to the lungs, or constrictive. So we have a narrowed airways. So for obstructive diseases, we have the bronchitis and asthma. Obstructive diseases are mostly when you are choking. So for the constrictive diseases, we have bronchitis and asthma. So bronchitis is the inflammation of the mucous membrane. When we have itis in the suffix, you have basically inflammation. So it's inflammation of the bronchi. So acute bronchitis caused by viruses and some bacteria that were able to bypass the upper respiratory tract. And the chronic bronchitis usually caused by smoking. And then we have asthma. Asthma is a constrictive pulmonary disease that can be life-threatening. So it can be, it ranges from being mild to actually severe and life-threatening. So during an asthma attack, the smooth muscle of the bronchi contract. So when it contracts, the airway passages becomes narrower. So basically, it constricts the airways. The mucus production increases and the bronchi swell. So depending on the severity of the attack, you can either just constrict the airway, narrow it down, or completely block the airway. So it's completely blocked, you can actually have a life-threatening asthma. And it can kill up 5,000 people every year in the US. So, the most common restrictive pulmonary diseases are the pneumonia, tuberculosis, emphysema, and lung cancer. So, in all of these diseases, the exhalation in the tubes of the airway do not spring back open because of a destruction of the elastic tissue. So, there's a pressure buildup in the lungs, and the patient tries to force air through the collapsed tubes, damaging the delicate alveoli and reducing the respiratory surface area. So, in pulmonary fibrosis, we have a destructive increase in collagen that makes the lungs less elastic. So, in these pulmonary diseases, in these types, you are actually destroying the tissues in the lungs. So, we have obstructive respiratory diseases. The chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases are those that obstruct the airflow. So, it can be emphysema and chronic bronchitis. Whereas, emphysema, it begins when a pollutant or a cigarette smoke damages your alveoli, forming holes that cannot be repaired. By the way, our lungs, unlike the liver, it cannot, when the tissues in the lungs are damaged, it's not easily repaired. So they are very delicate. So that is why smoking is bad for you, because it causes destruction of the alveoli. So this is emphysema. This is the normal alveoli, and this is the damaged one. So this is a healthy grape-like alveoli. This is a shrunken alveoli. The gases, damaged alveoli cannot properly exchange gases. So this is a scan of your lungs for that. Pneumonia. In pneumonia, you have bacterial invasion of the lungs. Bacteria that lives in the warm, moist lung tissue. In fact, the interior of the lung is the best place for a bacteria to thrive, because it's rich in warm, moist air. It has because the separation of the bloodstream and the surface of the alveoli is very thin. The bacteria can actually get a lot of nutrients from our bloodstream there. So the pneumonia is a general term for the buildup of the fluid in the lungs. Why do we have a buildup of fluid? Because again of the bacteria there. We have inflamed alveolar membranes that secrete the fluid in order to remove the pathogen, the bacteria in the lungs. And this fluid interferes with the gas exchange. So the symptoms of pneumonia includes productive cough. So that means you have a phlegm, lethargy, fever, chills, and shortness of breath. Then we have tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a disease that is caused by the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So it's actually a bacteria. So it can pass from person to person in airborne droplets generated by sneezes or coughs. So the bacterium, it enters the lymphatic system. So remember, inside the lungs, we have your macrophages that patrols the lungs. Unfortunately, Mycobacterium tuberculosis can thrive inside those macrophages. And so the response of the macrophages, of course, to bog down or to actually, if they cannot kill off those Mycobacterium pathogens, they just tend to isolate them. You form actually regions in the lungs where there is a high concentration of macrophages trying to isolate the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And so you have blockages in particular regions on your lungs. So the problem with Mycobacterium tuberculosis, they can remain dormant for years and then just reappear on the lungs without warning. So the symptoms are productive. That means you have a phlegm and often bloody cough. The blood is because of the damage already done in the lungs. So antibiotics are used to reduce the incidence of TB in some nations. But there's a problem now coming from that because there's a rise of antibiotic-resistant strains of TB. And that's a problem because, well, the only antibiotics is the only known cure for TB is the antibiotics. Before the advent of the antibiotics, lots of people die of TB. So it's if you read classical works from the 18th and 19th century, some of the tragic causes of deaths for the heroes, heroines, or even supporting characters is consumption. If you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's actually the cause of death for the little girl in Uncle Tom's Cabin. But anyway, back then, when people were diagnosed with consumption, that is TB, it's just like how people were today that has an end-stage cancer. There is no cure, and it's actually a very gruesome and bloody death. Now, however, right now, in the advent of the antibiotics, the doctors have been able to stem the TB, the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. However, again, because of perhaps too much antibiotic use, some people because not only are antibiotics used in medicine, antibiotics are also added in the chicken feed and the feeds of agricultural animals. Bacteria tend to develop resistance to that, and when you have a resistant, drug resistant or antibiotic resistant strain of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, it's very difficult to kill. Sometimes they are impervious to all known antibiotics that are used. So that is, of course, we're back to the 19th century again, where we can't find any cure for this tuberculosis. Okay, now we have lung cancer. So lung cancer causes 1/3 of all cancer deaths. So it affects the bronchi and alveoli. And one of the leading causes of lung cancer is tobacco smoke. So that is why actually there was a saying that if you smoke for 15 to 20 years, you have 100% chance of developing lung cancer when you grow old. It's not in immediate symptom or immediate effect, but you will see it when you enter 50 years old or 40 to 50 years old. Okay, so that's the problem with tobacco smoking. And then you have cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disorder. So this is found in the genes. This is a type of disease that is inherited. So we have a defective genes that controls the consistency of mucus in the lungs. So if you have a cystic fibrosis, your lungs is always there's a buildup of fluid in the lungs that obstructs the exchange of gases, because instead of you have a fluid covering the alveoli surfaces where oxygen cannot pass through. So the thick mucus traps bacteria and slows down the airflow through the bronchial tree and can also block the pancreas and the bile duct. So the current therapy, because this is a genetic disorder, the therapy is just to alleviate the symptoms. The surefire way to actually remove cystic fibrosis, to totally heal it, is that you must be able to change that defective gene. And that is actually still a challenge for us. Although with the advent of the CRISPR technology, things are the things are being optimistic. So researchers are optimistic that we can actually change the gene, because this is a genetic disorder. For genetic disorder, there is no cure unless we change the gene. So that's it for our respiratory system video.